to, okay.
Oh, you got it.
Now we're at the right part. So
Okay.
this one and this one. Right, welcome to the 29th Zoom Bessarion and Academia Bessarion. And today we're talking about, and I need to get to the presentation and to, we're talking about women in connection with the English cemetery. And there's another person to admit, and I don't know who that person was, but welcome. And I'm going to begin by saying that yesterday I read the lesson from Genesis on the creation of the world, which God sees as good, buono. And I thought how in quantum physics, our consciousness of the creation recreates it, as in books, particularly epics, and how fine it is when women equally write books in their own right, becoming like God, Dante, Milton. Then, when I was cycling home, I saw Vallombrosa in the dawn light. John Milton, who came to Florence and Vallombrosa and Arcetri in July, September 1638, was frequenting her academies like our Academia Bessarion. A misogynist, unlike Dante, but these men, by women writers, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and so forth. And this is my list of the people I will be teaching. Mary Wollstonecraft, Madame de Staël, Maria Edgeworth, Jane Austen, Frances Trollope, Mary Somerville, Mary Young, Mary Shelley, Anna Brownell Jameson, George Sand, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Theodosia Garrer Trollope, Isa Blagden, Cura Ellis and Acton Bell, who are Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte, George Eliot, Kate Beale, Virginia Woolf. And now we will go into the more detail about them. Mary Wollstonecraft writes vindication of the rights of women, but sadly, like so many women who are buried in the cemetery, she dies following childbirth because people didn't know to wash their hands when delivering babies, so the mother's blood became infected with a sepsis. And this would have been a trauma for her daughter, Mary Shelley. And this is the lecture I gave for my University of Berkeley, art here in Florence, in the beautiful Palazzo Guadagni, and I knew members of the Guadagni family. But I'm lecturing on Corinne ou Italy, the novel that was written by Madame de Staël, which became copied by many other women, especially Anna Brownell Jameson and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's a wonderful novel where Corinne is reciting verses about the freedom of Italy before Italy is free on the Campidoglio, on the Capitoline. And what's interesting is that Madame de Staël is the daughter of wife of the banker Necker, but she is actually the real daughter of Edmund Gibbon, who writes The Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire. And next we have Maria Edgeworth. She is an Irish writer, and some of her relatives are buried here. She wrote Rackrent Castle. She's describing the injustices of the landowners versus their tenants in Ireland, and which would cause eventually the terrible potato famine of the 1840s. but she is very anti-Semitic in her writings, and so is not making it into the canon. We also have relatives and also the owners of the home where she lived, of Jane Austen. So we have quite a few important people. Jane Austen's novels, I tended not to like them because they're all about women jockeying for positions, marriages to men who are jockeying for positions, whether it's army commissions or livings in the church and so on and so forth. It's all about gaining security for oneself in a rather gentlemanly way. But I preferred the sort of vinegar and heart of gold of Fanny Trollope, who had married an incompetent lawyer, hard brood of children, and took some of them up the Mississippi River, where she was trying to be an entrepreneur in Cincinnati, as well as trying to educate freed slaves. And she witnessed slavery firsthand and wrote a very powerful novel. But it's written with vinegar and a heart of gold, with a sense of humor as well. Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. She also writes against the abuses of children in mines and factories in Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy. She also writes about ecclesiastical abuse in The Vicar of Wrexhill, and also some wonderfully comic novels about the widow Barnaby. But her name means prostitute. And Robert Browning scorned her and didn't allow Elizabeth much access to her. Also, Elizabeth was a bit jealous of Fanny Trollope. Fanny uses plots by Terence, Moliere, and Fielding. Fielding, as you know, created the anti-hero in Jonathan Wild, real criminal, and so forth. And she's the mother of Anthony, who goes on to also be a novel writer, and of Thomas Adolphus Trollope, who comes to live in Florence and brings his mother here, as well as marrying the Bishop. This is a novel which we have now republished with the Trollope Society, and Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. And when she was in Cincinnati, she met with Hiram Powers, who was part Native American, and they did waxworks of Dante's Commedia on the American front. He was traveling with the children's tutor, who was a member of the Royal Academy of Art, and he illustrated Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, showing this character. This is Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, who is a complete bounder, and describing the poverty in the Mississippi River. This is where Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw is born. His mother is dying, but the sister and his father have great expectations of him. But this is a scene that they had actually seen of the sheer poverty, the mother shivering with fever following the childbirth. This is a scene in the novel, and so on. This is the ideal family. It's a German family that refuses to have slaves in the Deep South, but it's modeled actually on Trollope. This is a scene they actually witnessed, where the little slave boy is sent to buy tobacco for his master, and the whites kick the money out of his hand and scoff at him. And he knows he'll be beaten when he goes back, having lost the money and not been able to get the tobacco. Welcome. And then this is the daughter in the German family who is supporting herself with sewing. This is a cruelty to the slaves that is witnessed, and so forth. Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw in his white plantation owner's suit and so on. And then the daughter escapes and is cared for by the Native Americans. The heiress, who has one drop of black blood, this is according to law, She's losing everything she has, and she overdoses in laudanum. And her mother, who is black, is weeping at her deathbed. And this is the hero who is teaching the slaves how to read and write and teaching them the Bible. And he is, of course, lynched for having done that. These are the conditions that Frances Trollope saw given to the freed slaves, where she had gone with Lafayette's friend to help educate them, and they realized that the situation was so bad. Really, who is grateful to have learned the lesson. Yeah, and then this is the.
Mute yourself. Could you mute yourself, Sue?
Can you hear me? And
oh,
the until we finish, and then we'll have a chance to talk. What she observes is that men and the women are definitely kept separated from each other in America, which she objects to. And then I love this one, which is where Auguste Hervaux, the children's tutor, he is sketching them going to see, on only one day of the week are the women allowed to see naked statues, glass cast of Greek statues and so on. But this is Fanny Trollope, this is the daughter, Cecilia, and this is the maid, and we get the passports for them. This is in the Michael Armstrong factory boy, where the owner's son and the factory boy are friends, and this is not permitted. This is a scene they actually witnessed, where the children fled from the factory. The food was so dreadful to eat, the pigs will. And that would have been in Lancashire in a cotton mill. Now, Mary Somerville, she's not actually buried here. Her husband is. She, when he dies, goes to Naples, where she is also buried. Her name is knocked off her tomb and nobody knows who she is. But she, dying, was wishing that the slavery, horrible institution of slavery, could end. Had found a book of algebra and taught herself mathematics and discovered two planets. They couldn't make her member of the Royal Academy because she was a woman in the Royal Society, but they put a bust up of her and they made her husband son members. She taught Ada Lovelace. She also wrote textbooks for Cambridge University. She could not attend. She taught Ada Lovelace, George Lord Byron, and friends with Charles Babbage. And together they worked on the analytical computer program. The students and the visitors to the cemetery, who invented the computer? Dead silence. Nobody knows unless somebody hesitatingly says. They know it's later. It was two women. For Mary Young, I haven't. But it's a lovely tomb. And the English part of the tombstone says, to the memory of Mary Young, daughter of the late John Strother Ancrum of Rothwell, of the Reverend Robert Young, Doctor of Divinity, Minister of the Scots Church, London Wall, endowed with superior and refined intellect, firm character, and ardent affections, she was by God's grace enabled to spend her whole life in his service and we can't read that part, efforts for the good of others. Her faith was simple and unwavering, supported by this faith and shared by the hope, glory. She endured with fortitude the decay of her earthly tabernacle and joyfully welcomed the summons which called her hence. But the Italian side tells us that she spent many years in Italy doing research in the archives on Ionio Pagliario, who is Renaissance, a Protestant Italian in the Renaissance. And she lived a long time in Pisa school, and she was always helping the poor. And she loved studies, and she worked for the Risorgimento for the freedom of Italy. And she died in Florence at the age of 77 and so forth. She's the only one I don't have a picture of, but her descendants came the other day. Sent through medical school with her financial help, and that he had become a great Scottish physician. Now, Anna Jameson, and this is a charming picture of her as a child. She didn't become quite so beautiful later on, but she wrote many books. And one of them I particularly love is Loves of the Poets, where she describes Geraldine and so on and so forth, and which was a book that Elizabeth Barrett Browning read, and from which she wrote Lady Geraldine's Courtship, in which the heroine courts a poet, a low-born poet, which Robert read and caused him to write the first love letter to her. She'd actually proposed marriage to him in that poem before she met him. At the same time, she also proposed marriage to Tennyson. Anna Jameson also wrote Diary of an Ennuyé, which is modelled on Coralie of Madame de Staël. And it's both a love story, a disappointing love story, because she dies instead of finding her lover. But it's a travel book. And she describes the works of art she sees in Italy and so forth. And this is also done by Elizabeth Barrett Browning when she writes Casa Guidi Windows and Aurora Leigh, a book that Anna Jameson wrote as an art historian with sacred and legendary art, with her drawings, which became engravings. And she also wrote on Shakespeare's heroines. I read that when I was a teenager, and I didn't much like it, but I found her really fascinating. She supports Elizabeth's elopement. Then Mary Shelley, who writes Frankenstein and so forth, who is married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, but not in the beginning, because he is married to another. The marriage can take place when his first wife commits suicide. But the painting of her by Richard Rothwell, he's my ancestor. And he's buried with Keats and Shelley in Protestant cemetery in Rome. And now we come to George Sand, Aurore du Vent, much loved by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who finally was able to persuade Robert to let her visit her in France. Robert was very and so on and so forth, and didn't approve. But Elizabeth adored George Sand's novels, and also her name, Aurora, which becomes part her own character, Aurora Leigh, modelled as well, of course, on Michelangelo's Aurora. Here is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Became the engraving, which was partly done by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And she is writing an epic poem in 9 books with her knowledge of Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and her love, for instance, of the African poet Apuleius. She did her writing in this book, the Salone in Casa Guidi, stuffing the pieces of paper of her poetry, hiding them in the cushions of this chair. She had tuberculosis of the spine, was in great pain, and the Queen's doctor had addicted her to laudanum, which she was dependent on. Her last letter is to sell the convict ship, which had been the slave ship, the David Lyon, which was her pin money for buying her laudanum. And I think Robert coerced her into selling it just before she died of the laudanum. But she was a magnificent writer, and very glad we've just published her poetry in Italian with Le Lettere, or Bella Libertà, with Michelangelo's Aurora on the cover. Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, very much helped him write his novels. and while she was writing the notebooks on Florence, and they're splendid. And she describes visiting the Brownings and seeing firsthand the marital discordance between them. Robert is very disapproving of Elizabeth openly in front of company. Elizabeth is absolutely fighting for her own identity, and which is very much threatened by his behavior. She was a journalist who arrived in America and reporting on the Roman Republic, and was helping in the Princess Belgiossa's hospitals for Garibaldi. And during that time, she falls in love, meets in St. Peter's, the Marchese Orsoli. It's not possible for Italian Catholics to marry Protestant, English, or American women. But she insisted that there were documents when there weren't. But she arrives in Florence with their baby, Angelo, and Elizabeth is allowed to visit with her. They come to Casa Guidi. She gives to the baby a Bible, and unfortunately, the Marchese Orsoli, Margaret Fuller, and the baby all drowned in a shipwreck off our island. This is Elizabeth to write Aurora Leigh psychologically and to create her character, Aurora Leigh, as the character of Margaret Fuller, while the other character, Marian, is herself with her spaniel locks, and this gypsy is Roma. And the boy, the baby that's born illegitimately, is the sense she has of her own child. Her father has disowned her, and of Margaret's child, which were just 6 months apart, like Mary's child and John the Baptist's child playing together in the kinds of paintings that Anna Jameson described. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's a great friend of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The last letters that seemingly Elizabeth wrote was actually forged by Robert, saying no, she can't come to visit. Although they, and that's a few days before Elizabeth dies. Uncle Tom's Cabin was immediately translated into Romanian, freed the Roma slaves in Europe in 1853, saved them from the Holocaust. She's copying Francis Trollope and Richard Hillworth, both who are buried here. It's great friends, as I said, with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, what's interesting is that Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel and Sophia Peabody Hawthorne are all mixed together in his writing of the Scarlet Letter and the Blithedale Romance and the Marble Faun. And Marble Faun, Donatello, here I am in the Piazza Donatello, they say is Robert Browning. And when Frederic Leighton illustrated the last poem of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Musical Instrument, she is talking, and the letter was found by Thomas Adolphus Trollope amongst Isa's Lagden's. She is talking about Robert as Pan, who is using her, then killing her. And then Leighton will put the image of the god Pan into one of these harps on her tomb. Here is, see if I can show that. Okay, one of the grotesque faces here is the god Pan, and it's on this side. And here he shows Robert approaching the tomb. Robert never came back to see the tomb. Leighton carefully designed her portrait with her head to one side and the spaniel locks. What's on the tomb is the exact opposite, because Robert, in the sculptor Giovinazzi, carrying out Leighton's design, decided she was ugly. And here it is, excuse me, I need to go back. Theodosia Garrow Trollope is here with her daughter Beatrice, Fanny Trollope, and Thomas Adolphus Trollope. Their villa in the Piazza Maria Antonia, now Piazza Indipendenza. And Fanny Theodosia Trollope is mixed race. Her father is the son of an Indian princess and her mother is Jewish. And Beecher will marry into English nobility. And then Isa Blagden, same kind of background. They both, Theodosia and Isa, become Miriam in Hawthorne's marble form. Tell, is she East Indian? Is she Jewish? Is she part black? This mixture of races, this mystery about her. Florence is the sunny place for shady people, people who couldn't fit in very well into English society, could here. She is very much in love with Robert Leighton, who as a poet publishes under the name Owen Meredith and writes a poem about her called Lucille. And she writes a novel about him called Agnes Tremont. He becomes Viceroy of India and marries a proper English girl, but he can't marry her. And their daughters will become suffragettes, fighting for the rights for women to vote. And this is the view from her house, Bellesguardo, by John Brett, the pre-Raphaelite artist, with the Hebrew cemetery nestled up behind the wall. And the wall is still intact in his painting with the gates like a great crown around. And now the Brontes. And my family deeply connected with the Brontes. My great-grandfather was taught by Patrick Bronte in New Charlotte. He grew up in Haworth. And until he was 11 years old, when he walked barefoot to cross the moors to work in Bradford. His father had participated in the Battle of Waterloo and could only sign his name with a cross. But Sir James Roberts became first manager at 18 and then owner of Saltaire, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and bought Haworth Parsonage for the nation and endowed a chair of Russian because he was doing trade with some people. And he and his wife very much honored the Bronte sisters. And he gets into T.S. Eliot's Wasteland as the top-hatted, smoke-hatted Bradford millionaire. And that was the result with the T.S. Eliot Society giving the funds to save the Bronte parsonage over COVID. But Elizabeth read Jane Eyre and she unconsciously plagiarized it. Romney is Rochester, who shows up in Florence to see Aurora, and he's blind in a kind of an accident when his utopian settlement he has created. Now we come to George Eliot and her illustrator for Romola. What is fascinating is that Frederic Lord Leighton, who only became Lord the day he died, but he's devastatingly handsome, never married, and paints marvelous academic paintings. He's at the same time as a pre-Raphaelites, but isn't a pre-Raphaelite. And he's very much pro-women. He's the one who insists on doing Elizabeth's tomb. Robert had paid even less than for a pauper's burial for Elizabeth, and it said he didn't care whether her tomb was wood or gold. It was Leighton who took on that task, and then the friends of Robert, and Robert botched it. But this is a self-portrait of Leighton as a young prodigy, and I love this portrait of George Eliot. She wasn't as beautiful as that, but I'd like. I love this engraving that Leighton did of Romola, furious when Tito comes back and she has found that he has two wives and the other wife has a baby. as Tessa. When Leighton was only 25, he painted this enormous painting which Queen Victoria bought and is now in National Gallery of Cimabue's procession with the Madonna. Dante, you get Charles of Anjou, but these, of course, will all be posed with models, so it's very much trying to be historically correct, but somehow too stilted. The pre-Raphaelites got it a bit better, I think. But this is the death of Brunelleschi with the vision of the Duomo, so forth. This is again by Leighton. And now Seymour Kirkup was this mad Englishman who had known Keats and Shelley and so forth, who lived on the Via de' Bardi and with a vast collection of books and a very, very young second wife and a daughter born of her and so forth. But he becomes the character of Bardo de' Bardi in the daughter has to help him with his Greek and his Latin. And it's sort of like Milton's daughters to their father. Tito arrives. He's a Greek and seems he's a real hypocrite. He's a villain like Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, like Jonathan Wild, but he wins over Florentine culture, which is mad about anything Greek, having adopted into itself at the fall of Constantinople the sense that this is the second Constantinople and so forth. And he marries Romola while also having an affair with Tessa. And then there are various events that happen. Here's a monkey that's chasing him with a horse and so on. Then, a painter, Piero de Cosimo. The novel is based with many real people, especially Greek scholars at the time following Cardinal Bessarion. And he has painted a painting of Tito showing him as evil, which shocks Romola. Tito here is buying a coat of chain mail because his father is threatening to kill him, because Tito has not ransomed his father from slavery. There's a theme of slavery in Romola. Lantern, it's still here in Florence. This is something that Leighton has observed when he was a young student at the Accademia de Belle Arti. He's putting into the pages of Romola's, George Eliot's Romola, which is deeply researched. And what I'm hoping to do is to put together the Leighton illustrations, with I'll show you later the photographs. Here is Tessa showing the baby to the father, Baldassare. And here is Tessa with the baby in the cradle. Here is Monna Brigida, Brigida, and so forth. And here is Baldassare murdering Tito. And I loved what was said when George Eliot wrote, it's in great excitement, I killed Tito. And she was delighting in having created this evil character who seems on the surface to be so brilliant, is so immoral in everything that he. Now, I was absolutely fascinated with this because the other day I bought in a bookshop 2 volumes of Romola with the photographs, edited by Guido Biagi, who was librarian eventually of the Laurentian Library, had also worked in Rome, had been an editor, and I had always loved his work, the enormous volume he did of Dante commentaries. And he also was responsible for publishing Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, because he ran a children's magazine in Rome. And then a splendid edition of George Eliot's Romola, complete with photographs and illustrations of Florence as it was. But he corrects her. For instance, she uses the word signore, And he points out it wasn't in use yet then. They would have used it, and so on. And when she gets a building wrong, he corrects that in a footnote. His work is absolutely wonderful because he does appreciate her. And he was also he was one of the founders of la Società Dantesca Italiana. I'm a member of it. He was also working with the Florence's British Institute. What's interesting is that Romola begins with Tito, who has been shipwrecked and is in rags. He's asleep right by the Casa di Dante. This is before the fake museum, which was built over in this part. This is the real Casa di Dante. And it says that this is Auguste's hair before the fake museum. This is, and I've been able to trace back, this architecture goes right back to 1310. Lorenzetti shows it with the life of, and we know that the house was not destroyed when Dante was exiled because it was under the protection of Corso Donati, his wife Emma being a Donati. They just stole all of his furniture, his library. And that's going to be what Romola will never forgive Tito because he sells off them. But this is one of the photographs in the Biagi book. This is the column with the statue of Vandanza, which they say is Donatello's statue. This is the Piazza della Repubblica before the fish market was moved to the Brontes. And here we have the painting in the Santa Maria Novella with the various noble characters, Greek scholars, and so on. I can't read it, but unfortunately. And then this painting of Agnolo Poliziano. I used to see this when I would be reading manuscripts in the Biblioteca Nazionale. It was always there. They seem to have removed it now. But he does seem a bit creepy. And this is a photograph of Porta a Pinti. These are the cypresses in our cemetery. And this is the stemma of the lily, which we still have on our wall. But you can see how this gate, which is now destroyed, it had these wonderful frescoes inside. They are very still in the other gates, which have still survived, but this one was torn down by Giuseppe Boggi. Then Kate Field, she was a friend of Walter Savage Landor, another. She never married, but she was very much involved with spiritualism and so forth. But she writes really important, gathers together important materials, especially she sees Elizabeth Barrett Brown. A couple of pens. And she's horrified by the way in which the burial is carried out. And then we have the enchanting book by Virginia Woolf, illustrated by Vanessa Bell, of Flush, as well as a splendid essay on Aurora Lee in the Common Reader. And this was given to us in this library, the second edition of Flush, with the drawings by Vanessa Bell on its end papers. Vanessa Bell had not been to Florence and didn't know the Casa Guidi does not have a view of Florence. But I really appreciated that gift. And then Iris Origo, who writes The Merchant of Prato and War in Valdorca, seeing that novels are books and so forth. We use neuroscience and quantum mechanics. We can see that books raise our shared consciousness. They can map time and space and can come, in the case of, for instance, Elizabeth Barrett Browning with Marianelle Gibson, Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom. They come to exclude it. They create a democracy instead of a hierarchy, even if Jane Austen is showing how you climb the social ladder and so on and so forth. And now we can end the honor, and if we can find vista, the gallery, right. And so we've got Angela Camilla. Can you unmute and turn on your video too? And Noria.
Hello,
Welcome.
Julia.
Right. I hope it made sense. Because I haven't finished my work on Romola. Long Victorian novel in one day to be able to present it. So it was a bit ragged. Sorry about that. But
can people introduce themselves, because I don't know these people so well as some that come
right,
out.
okay. Anora,
Give me a second. Hold on.
yes, great.
Hello, I'm Honora, and I'm trying to figure out how to turn my video on.
Right, tell us about yourself.
Well, see if
I'm 65 years old. I'm reading a lot of history. I'm doing a lot of writing, and I'm fascinated by everything you post.
It's a bit ragged, I'm afraid. But I'm fascinated by you.
Nora,
Right.
do you know how to find your the little thing that looks like an old-fashioned movie camera? Is turn video on.
And it's on the top of your.
Oh, come on.
Are you on an
I think you
iPad?
have to put the slide across. At any rate, Camilla, Angela, can you tell us anything about fiction and law?
Well,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. That's a wonderful question. I just my impression of this presentation, which is not ragged at all. It's just wonderful. I am always amazed at the accomplishments of women
Yes.
in history.
Yes.
All over and over again, and yet the refusal to accept the as intellectual equals.
Right.
We can talk about law, but that was just my over and over again with each slide. And it's all of your presentations, Julia, because you highlight the women, such accomplished women, such brilliant women, such activist women, and who have an amazing contribution to the world, have made that, and yet are so hidden and didn't seem to convince anyone at the time of notions of equality, unless you think that they were laying the groundwork for much of what comes later when we have the suffrage movement, etc. Could you speak to that a little bit about whether you think it was kind of layering?
Yes. What I think they got right was their sense of solidarity. They were sort of writing history from below. They were siding with the underdog. It could be the slave, it could be the child, it could be the nation under an empire. But they were showing that the world was lacking equal rights, and that this was a direction they needed to take. And they were using, which was really, just sort of a mask over what was fact. When Fanny is showing what was going on in the South as she goes up the Mississippi River, is still going on. it hasn't stopped the cruelty. Good to see you. We can see you now. And I think feminism lost it when it only became about women being like men. Because I don't think being like men is the answer. I think it's the problem. But I think the sense of value of all human life is crucial. And not only all human life, but equality. But we need that sensitivity. And that they were trying to teach that through the form of entertainment, the novel, in which you become lost. You create an alternative universe to live in for a time. But in that, you also learn empathy. And it's interesting that they are creating characters also who lack empathy. Tito, for instance, Melon, the horror. So is Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. And they're showing that these male characters who exploit and who are criminal are simply not acceptable, that it's behavior reprehensible. So in a sense, they're functioning like judges.
Julia, is there a
Yes.
word for that, for literature performing that function to expose hypocrisy, expose abuse of power? Is there a term for that?
I don't think there really is. They are writing documentaries which are masquerading as fiction, but they're about reality.
Yeah.
Is to go into a distant past and to talk about adultery, so on and so forth, the Arthurian romances. And then the novel comes along and the men write novels about, again, adultery, Anna Karenina, and so on and so forth, Madame Bovary. But the women are doing something else. They're talking about injustice and how to achieve justice, I think. And they do get read. I was quite amazed. The BBC asked me to participate in Women's Hour, and I thought, oh dear, only women are going to listen to this. Tonight, only women are listening to this. But what was amazing?
Julia, we're not hearing you.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah.
Okay. All these men were writing to me saying they'd heard me on the BBC. They were listening to Women's Hour. I wasn't expecting that. They were noble descendants of people in the cemetery. So on. So actually, I do feel that the men clandestinely are sort of paying attention. I mean, they do read George Eliot and so forth, so that message gets over. But George Eliot's male characters, these dry as dust scholars like Casaubon in Middlemarch and so on, these marriages that don't work, Tito's and Romula's and Dorothea's and Casaubon's. This is really heady stuff. And then Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she's even talking about the mother killing the baby because it's got the face of the white master who raped her and so on. I'm wondering whether somebody is going to get upset about us having translated that word. It's almost too modern for us.
Well, in our day, we have people like Edwidge Danticat and Toni Morrison and Black women writers who address these
yes
situations.
Yes.
with a lot of knowledge that some
Right.
people would rather not know. You know, they're showing realities that people shy away from
Right.
because it's so horrible.
Yes. Mhm, mhm. I'll never forget flying back to Europe and having to spend time waiting for a flight in the Philadelphia airport. And there's a room there where they've got on the wall and, you know, welcoming you to America with the major documents and so on. And there was a black lady there, and I had extra change for American money, which I didn't need to take back to Europe. And I asked the woman at the coffee place what to do with it. She said, give it to her. And then she started telling me her story. She had been raped as a child and had given birth to a baby out, you know, just amongst in the rubbish. And she was so terrified, she'd walked away, leaving the baby. And for that, she was imprisoned, and the baby survived. And there she was telling me the story, which was straight out of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, in this room with the American documents and so on. And, you know, that horror of the violation of a child with rape and so on, and the consequences of that biologically. She wasn't able to cope. There's no one around to assist her with that. And she was talking about how the guilt that she had felt, but that also that the child who survived did forgive her. They did reconcile and so on. But I think the courage that these women had to talk about. I mean, Charlotte Bronte talks about the abuse in the orphanage, Lowood School, where her two sisters died, and so on and so forth. So I think, in a sense, they're trying to heal society by telling the truth. But they have to tell the truth pretending it's a lie. It's fiction, not fact. This is a real paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Julia?
Sue, yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
A couple of things that I keep thinking about based on what you're saying. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, for one thing, okay, so the early 1600s and prior, there was the witch trials, and it wasn't just in the US. We hear in Salem, Mass. It was also going on in England, and some of the priests, well, I don't know if they're called priests, but it's a Protestant, they would write books, you know, how, and that Americans were reading and saying, oh, how we're going to find a witch. So I really think that put the stomp on women's and their creativity and their expression and equality for a really long time, because if anybody deviated from whatever mainstream, they had the risk of being called a witch. And, you know, so I think even after maybe the witch trial era ended, it kept going psychologically to keep women from expressing themselves. So when women did express themselves in some of these books, where you were saying, did they try to show that they were trying to make social justice, or were they just trying to kind of express it and go under the radar at the same time? So I just keep on going back to these witch trials lately.
Yeah.
And there's another book, a film that's actually up for an Academy Award. It's called Women Talking. And this was supposedly set in 2010, and they call it a remote religious community where women are getting together because they're realizing they're, well, being raped, and they want to figure out what to do, and how to get out and things like that. So that kind of made me think of that. And it's like right now it's up for Academy Award movie called Women Talking. So I haven't seen it, but it it's just keeps on going and going, and unfortunately it could keep going, in a worse direction than it is now, with the politics the way it is. But I'm just trying to grapple with the thought of Sharia law and how it's raising its head in the United States now. But anyway, that was basically what I've been thinking about lately. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, because I wear a veil and so on, which it's not allowed in French law. They're trying to block. What about nuns and so on and so forth? During COVID, we all boxes with masks immediately after all of that row against women wearing the hijab. But
well, I'm not against women doing it because they want to do it.
yes,
What I'm against is people being forced. And
yes,
and I was just thinking about your veil in Philadelphia and how that woman opened up to you. She probably, saw you as the closest person to a religious figure and did some kind of confessional, but that's what the veil can do, which is very powerful, especially if it's, you obviously look like you're a nun, so people can approach you in that way. But anyway, it's just a strange thing. I hadn't thought you had problems just being yourself walking down the street in Florence with a veil.
actually, it actually helped. I mean, people don't want to sit next to me, for instance, and so on and so forth. And but it sort of means, no, I'm not.
Julia, your voice is coming and going. I don't know why.
It's probably because this microphone isn't so good. I find it's a protection that it sort of makes me genderless. I don't know how to explain that. It gives me a freedom. And so I understand why a Muslim woman does it, because it's about dignity and respect, and it is about freedom, paradoxically. And so, but that's the, but the other thing I really, I don't read novels, and I tell people not to give us novels for our library because they take up too much time and too much space. And I want books which are not fiction. But at the same time, there is something wonderfully therapeutic in a film, taking your mind off your own problems and doing this sort of sandboxing of an alternative universe.
Well,
And
I think
lately,
what you said about empathy, I do think, and I know that show on public radio called Human Brain had an episode about developing empathy. People who read novels, who read books and experience life through the book actually do develop more empathy.
right. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think this things that troubles me so much is in modern education, which is so left brain, means that we lose empathy. It's countering the human interaction. But to go back to talking about the brain, it maps the world around itself, doesn't it? If you move house, you're discombobulated because your memory system of where things are is lost temporarily. You have to rebuild it. You know how when you go from one room to another, there's a moment when you can't remember what you went into the other room for. It's because your brain has to remap for the other room, and the other room doesn't connect with the room you've just left, and so on and so forth. But this is what they're saying now with quantum mechanics, is that we actually realities between us.
Say that again. Say it
Okay,
again.
if we are not of the reality around us, it's a bit going back to Bishop Berkeley, it doesn't exist. We actually affect the surrounding by our consciousness of it. Thing as cat stuff, okay? But I think this is what we do in novels, is we set up a universe that becomes a model for the real one. So we sandbox the way you do with the Wikipedia page.
Well, the only thing I can remember is reading novels and not wanting it to end, and just because I became part of that world.
Yes.
And that could be like not exactly the best thing for academia, but it might have built my empathy, and it certainly was entertaining, and I'm sure I learned from it. But I just do remember that, oh, please don't be over. This book is so good. Whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. But as far as the sandbox is, I don't know what you mean by that, but I think it's a play place. It does give us at least a something to talk to other people about that is of ideas.
That's wonderful when you share a novel, right?
Yeah,
I can remember teaching in nursery school before I went back to school. And I would teach 2 days and 3 days in a Jewish school and 2 days in a Catholic school with small children. And one of the other teachers in the Jewish school, we realized that we had both, as teenagers, read Dostoevsky's The Idiot. I had read him in English and she had read him in Hebrew. And we were absolutely fascinated by this sharing that had happened. And the same thing happened when I went on the delegation to heads of state for the Quakers to the Russian ambassadors. And we ended up talking about Dostoevsky. These novels can be wonderful icebreakers where they're shared universes. And so they become a shared humanity. And that's one of the splendid things that's happening now, is that so many novelists are of other races and are teaching us their cultures through novels. I'm thinking of the English Merchant and so forth, which is set here in Biagi, the film that was written afterwards. And also Black novelists like The Invisible Man, which we used to teach at Princeton and so forth. It was for those white male students at Princeton, Angela, it was quite something for them to experience that novel. Because Angela and I were the first generation, really, of it was difficult, wasn't it? We were definitely made to feel that we didn't belong.
You were at Princeton at the same time?
Yes, she was my student at Princeton.
That's right. Julia was my professor of medieval studies.
Wonderful.
Yes.
And we did a liturgical drama together.
In this gorgeous chapel and Gregorian chant and Latin and so forth.
What
And
was the liturgical drama?
I forget which one it was. It the Officium Peregrinorum?
It was the women at the resurrection. It was Easter morning. The women coming to the tomb, and it was it was wonderful. We had the costumes and the
And you
text.
helped, your father helped with the costumes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. He
Wow.
supplied the he was a shoe repairman, and so he supplied the shoelaces, the leather shoelaces. That's right.
Yeah. Wow.
That was
Angela,
1977. So
that's right. Angela was a scholarship student at Princeton. Her father was a cobbler in. And you're teaching now international.
I teach at Seton Hall Law School, and I don't do much international any longer. I teach property and religion and the First Amendment, and we, the human rights aspect is all pervasive, of course, whether domestic or international. But
Yes.
so, but you were my original inspiration, or
You were
just
mine.
the love of learning, because I
You
came to Princeton, and it was a wonderful role model for me. You, Julia.
She recited Dante so beautifully in my class. You wowed us all. Do you remember?
Yeah, I haven't done that in a long time. It was my in high school I took Italian. We didn't speak Italian at home because you didn't do that. My parents were born in the United States. Their parents, my grandparents, were immigrants, and but in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you did not speak another language. So, but I took Italian in high school, and that's where I did the Dante. It was the Canto Terzo. I did it for some competition, and so it was fresh in my mind. I was able to recite it for you, and it's long gone now, but abandon all hope. But
right, yes.
That's still very much with me.
Yeah, I found it very difficult when I first came to America. I was 16, and this was California. Many of the students at San Jose State, where I did my undergraduate work, were Italian background. I'd just been with a French family in Paris, and so I was used to talking with my hands. And the Italian immigrants would put my hands down at my side and say, "We don't do that."
Oh.
It was like losing my soul because I needed to express myself. And then when I went to Australia, I was really upset, and so were the Italians, because they wanted the mass in Italian. And they was completely, they were doing things that nobody does in Italy any longer. They were making pasta from scratch. Their work was absolutely exquisite, the sewing, the cooking, but the Archbishop Pell was refusing to allow them their language. Everything had to be English only. And they were.
I remember excuse me. Go ahead. I was going to say in Brooklyn when I was growing up in the mid-60s, I remember St. Regina Pages was our parish, and there was the extreme going from Latin to English. That was the big move then. And it was an Italian community, but they didn't expect it to be Italian, but it went from Latin to English. And that was a big deal.
Yeah. So we have sort of patterns of oppression from the hierarchy.
We're losing you again.
It's almost as if to say, well, perhaps my going with a veil, thinking of myself as genderless, but it's almost as if they're saying, no, you're not allowed your gender. Back with Blackstone's law, a woman had no legal rights. Only her father or her husband had them for her.
Well, that's like what's going on in Afghanistan and a lot of other places
Yes.
right now.
How difficult that is. I found it very interesting when grandmother died, there was, still a little bit of wealth left. Most of it's gone. But part of the trust was under Scottish law and part of it was under English law. And under English law, it was the first male son who got it. Under Scottish law, it was divided equally amongst all of the children, male and female. So there's a wild difference. And there I was with 3 sons and the grandson at that point, and myself. And my brother was furious because it meant that we got the same amount of money as he did. And he thought that was unfair. We should not have got anything because I was a woman, nor our children who were his nephews and so forth. But it's a different world and they clash. It's really hard to see. But I think we ought to wind up this discussion. I don't know what to talk about next week, next month. Any suggestions? We're trying to put Romola as a kind of app to explore Florence, using both Leighton's drawings, designs, engravings, and the photographs of Guido Biagi has put together. But I think we need, what subject should we go to next? What would you like to be hearing about?
Well, I'll just say something. With Romulus, I think it would be interesting for me to learn more about her perspective on the actual fall of the Roman Empire. And, that's just something that I would find interesting. Anybody else?
What I find interesting there is how the Irish, it was the people at the margins that came back to the centre that revived it, that it went dead at the centre. We could try to talk about that a bit.
I remember you did bring that up in one of your lectures not too long ago. I thought that was very interesting. But yeah, Julie, you always come up with something great.
Angela, you got any suggestions?
Well, I'm thinking of 2 things. One, if there are any racial differences in a historical period, that because that's such a big part of today's consciousness, diversity, inclusion, those ideas, and sort of, are there comparable periods that might teach us something, or at least again, some Laura mentioned about race, so again, I don't know, but that could be very interesting. The other thing that you said earlier was that the problem with sort of modern feminism being about women being like men. My problem, I agree, but my problem with sort of being told by men what women are, when we are complementary, we are, we're all about feeling, and men are about, numbers or whatever it is. I really dislike that intensely. So I'm now this is just out of just basically something that really, really bothers me when, for instance, there is a papal statement from the Catholics. I read I do a lot of the Catholic social teachings. I'm thinking about that a lot of depth, a lot of richness in those. But, you'll have these statements that are written by men. about
know.
what it means to be a woman and
Yeah.
how the complementarity fits, and that's why we can't be priests and all that. So I guess that would be, I would love to hear more about what is woman.
Right.
I mean, I know it's not just one, obviously it's multifaceted, but from women.
Right. I absolutely agree. It's a terrible problem. For instance, it was wonderful when Francis came out with Laudato Si. Absolutely splendid. And I couldn't have agreed more. And then they came out with something on women, which was really written by the men. And it was dreadful. And, even in Italian, it was dreadful. It was dreadful in English. And I of course, dead silence, none of my letters. Actually, in Italy, you can send a letter to the Pope and it goes through the post free. You used to put a stamp on it, it's sent free. But it doesn't get read. And lately, I've been working with realizing the multiple deaths of women following childbirth because the men refused to wash their hands.
Well, that was true over here too. That's true all through American history.
Right. And that is an argument you can use for the priesting of women. Realize that
I'm not sure if they knew that it was dangerous or they just were too lazy.
No, I don't think they understood
they weren't listening to the women, the midwives, the nurses. The nurses had been for centuries. But the men thought they could walk into the operating theatre or whatever with unwashed hands. And there was enormous resistance. The doctor who first realized that the babies, the mothers were not dying where they were delivered by midwives, but were dying like flies where the men were coming in from doing autopsies. He actually died of a sepsis in an insane asylum because he was so resistant.
Who was that?
Semmelweis, Ignaz Semmelweis. He was Hungarian. And I think we almost need to do.
You're going out again. We can't hear you.
We're losing you again.
About that in relation to the church's male hierarchy, because the gospel is not hierarchical, it's the exact opposite. It's where Jesus brings the elderly lady with osteoporosis, she can't make it up the stairs to the women's gallery in the synagogue. He brings her right into the midst of the men and says she's the daughter of Abraham. And it's there in the gospel that there should be this universal genderizing or non-genderizing, not important, the gender. The humanity is important. And, that way we don't have to become like men.
That is so strange.
I have a question for you, Angela. Is Seton Hall the university in Pennsylvania?
No, it's New Jersey.
No, you're thinking of Seton Hill College. Seton Hall is in South Orange, New Jersey, the university, and the law school is in Newark.
Okay, because I had my father's aunt Serafina was a Catholic nun who taught at Seton Hill, I think, in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Okay.
That's we get mixed up with them sometimes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's out, I think, closer to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's out in western Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to make one more comment. It's interesting the topic was on women, and it appears that we're all women here. I don't know if there are any gentlemen who came in. And the whole kind of women talking, we've gone into like a deeper level that sometimes we don't get into when there's men there, and I just wanted to observe that. And I had just made a note today for myself because I've been reading about how to avoid negative thoughts and different psychologists advising. They said, well, if you're going to have negative thoughts, when it comes up, just write it down and say you're going to give yourself 10 minutes a day to think negative thoughts. And my negative thought for today, this morning, was I would have been a lot more successful if I had been born a man.
Ah,
And it was just, I said, well, I got to think about that. Why did I just wrote it down, and I was like, interesting. Well, I just want to thank the women in this group for listening to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, all of you. Right.
thank you,
I must say,
Julia.
my father cried when I was born because I was a girl. And I was to be named Julian.
He
So they had
didn't know what he was talking about, Julia.
of republishing his books and so forth. And of you. And good night, ladies.
Good night. Sleep tight,
Thank you.
Julia.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.